So, Tom, how do we help people to deal with the stuff before it happens? Because
Yeah.
they don't want,
Well,
people don't want to talk about dying. People don't want to talk about getting disabled and getting sick, or am I going to be buried, or am I going to be, you know, dealing with my remains in a different way? I mean, come on.
sure.
How do we begin these sensitive discussions? What stage?
Sure. Well, I think that I'm glad that you asked it in a timing question because imagine, the best practices that we see in not just our industry and our professional discipline, but in, medicine and law. The best thing to do is to pre-solve all of these problems beforehand and to have your insurances and your legal documents and you've already had your conversation with your kids. And imagine that that's really only 20-30% of the population are those kinds of planners. And a lot of them were the ones that bought my long-term care insurance a long time ago. A lot of them are the ones that move into life plan communities if they can afford it, so on and so forth. And I think for that population, the way you answer the question, how do you mitigate it, is you scenario build. What about best case? What about worst case? And you sort of breadcrumb. What are the different sets of decisions that we might make in advance? Because we certainly don't want to start thinking about this stuff for the first time in an emergency room. Leo, there's the big middle though, and we call the big middle the procrastinators. And the procrastinators are folks that like, look, I know exactly what the issues are, all right, and I know that I have not had this conversation with my kid, and my will is sort of half done, and I have this bejangly looking business interest over here that I never got around to doing, and I'm kind of managing this health thing over here. So when there's news about sort of a change in status or decision making or circumstance or whatnot, imagine there's immediately oh, I shoulda, woulda, coulda, shoulda, and I don't have all my ducks in a row. And how do you serve families in that circumstance? It usually has to do with two things that are important. The first one is I think that you always want to start from a place of hope. The idea of, given what you know now, Leo, my friend who just came up with this crummy diagnosis, I'm serving you. Given what you know now, like right now, what are the things that you're most hopeful for? What are you most hopeful for yourself? What are you most hopeful for you and your wife, for your kids, your grandkids, and whatnot? And it's extremely important to zero in on the new vision of the things that you're hopeful for and start building around that as compared to, Leo, what are you really worried about? What's the thing that you never want to have happen? How bad could it get? Like, the reason that you don't want to zero in on that is there's an enormous amount of research in psychology that says fear-based decision making isn't effective. It kind of collapses on itself. It's something that you keep digging a hole down. Hope has a distinct concept, engages different parts of the brain, and you get more easily past like the parts of the brain that are impacted by fear and anxiety, where your analytical function sort of shuts down. By zeroing in on things that you're hopeful for, you think forward, you're more imaginative. That's how you do it. What you do is going to be dependent a lot on two things. One, which is what exactly is your health circumstance? And realistically, what would be prescribed in terms of a plan for you and what your circumstance is? And if it's a mobility issue, are there things that can be done to the home, or do you need to move? But you start driving your forward look based on where a particular medical condition might take you. And that's going to vary. The Parkinson's story is going to be different than the dementia story, which is going to be different than a mobility story. So you want to be sensitive to that medical starting point that you're looking at. I always want to sort of zero in on this last piece, which is the idea of acceptance. And this isn't just for financial advisors. This is for you and me and our listeners who are just plain old human beings. And the idea of acceptance, when things change and our priorities change and our abilities change, acceptance really means being able to look at something the way it is and to be able to say, that's the way it is. It's not the same as surrender or giving up, or like, it's not any of those things. It's just being able to assess reality and being able to use that as a jumping off point for future decisions. And that might be an area for family members or clergy or professionals like financial advisors to help our clients kind of accept and define the reality that they're in right now. That's sort of part of the how for that big middle of procrastinators. And Leo, there's one last group, which we haven't talked about. Remember, planners, procrastinators. Who's the last group? The last group are crashers. The last group are the ones that are not watching this podcast, the ones that don't have really anything done. And these are personalities that we all know in our lives that, for better or worse, crash into the system, have an expectation that something or somebody is going to rescue them. And they end up getting the worst outcomes, and somebody has to come in and pick up the pieces. So often it's spouses, adult children. There's this whole group of attended professionals that try to pick up pieces and whatnot. But I mean, it should just sound like common sense. Crashers put an enormous strain on the system, and we all have to react to the resources that they take up, whether you're a planner or a procrastinator along the way. And I've learned, somewhat cynically, but realistically, there's no talking to crashers. They're just going to crash, and you got to just manage them after the fact. So really, the place that I really like to impact is this procrastinator group in the middle, because they're almost there, they're sensitive, and how can we drive better calls to action to get them better outcomes if we can zero in on things that they're hopeful for?